Hi, my name's Ben Northey. I'm the Associate Conductor of the Melbourne Symphony Orchestra, and this morning I'm here with Stuart Greenbaum to have a talk about his Symphony No. 2, Double Planets. Stuart, welcome. Good to see you. How are you going?
Really well, Ben.
That's good. I thought we'd talk specifically about how you make the transition from composing a piece of music to actually hearing it performed for the first time. We recorded this piece a couple of months ago, I suppose, and I'm interested to know how it changed in terms of what you were hearing when you wrote the piece and what you heard on the day of recording.
There are always surprises. You spend a lot of time writing the piece, and all the time while you're either working on pen and paper or at the piano or at the computer, all the time you're trying to imagine the orchestra in the space playing your piece. So on the day when you actually arrive at the venue and you hear it for the first time, of course, the melodies are the melodies, the harmonies, the rhythms, the textures are mostly as you're thinking they're going to be. But there are always surprises, and you're always trying to imagine what do I think the surprises are going to be. And in part, having conversations with the conductor yourself and some of the musicians beforehand is useful. But you certainly find out quite a lot in that first hour when the piece is unfolding for real in front of you.
Perhaps we can explain a little bit about how the process works with the collaboration between composer and conductor specifically, because the conductor is the person who needs to communicate your wishes to the orchestra and needs to bring this piece, to life in a way that, you imagined it. You and I obviously had sessions before the recording process, but, in terms of how we decide to approach the recording and what we do on the day, what issues are really important for the composer and conductor to agree on, do you think?
I guess first and foremost, the things that come up both in the discussions beforehand and then actually on the day are tempo and feel.
Yeah.
That's probably the most crucial thing, because you're not suddenly going to transpose the whole piece up by a major second or anything like that. The pitch and the rhythm, the notes where they are pretty much going to be where they are. But how they're interpreted in time, in space, is a big issue. Dynamics, volume, how the whole sort of sound comes across emotionally actually is a big issue. How sort of convincing or rich or intriguing or contrasted. But probably the starting point is tempo and feel. And you spend a lot of time getting very, very exact tempos on computers, and you get used to this because you listen to it over and over, and sometimes, of course, in your head, but your head is, in a sense, sort of, in part, replaying what you've been listening to on the computer. So you get this really exact kind of 160 in your head. And then you get into a live space with a group, and you have to revise something that for all of that pre-period has been an absolute fixed certainty. And then in a very short space of time, you really need to listen carefully, and then it becomes less about, is it 160, is it 162, is it 150? And I think actually that first movement we did end up taking a little bit slower. But we were really, even when we were talking beforehand, we knew that it was pushing the woodwinds, for instance, to the limit of what was technically possible on the instruments. But what we really wanted to achieve with that first movement was a sense of drama and propulsion. And actually it wasn't about the numbers per se, it was about feel, and I think we captured that.
Well, that's interesting that you talk about the computer, as a compositional tool versus the orchestra as the performance tool. And I think it's something that we can talk about, because most people, if they're composing, at high school or, at home, wherever, they're working on computers. They hear a MIDI version or a digital playback version of their piece, and then all of a sudden, which is in a nice controlled environment, as soon as it gets in front of living people and real musicians, it can be a very, very different thing. I mean, you're an experienced composer who can kind of, hear what it's going to sound like and imagine what it might sound like. But for less experienced people, what's your advice in terms of what to write on a computer and what to expect when you come to an orchestra?
Well, I think part of it is anything that can take you outside of just only the computer is useful. Even if that meant going into a space and playing some of the material in a real live room on the piano, or even just humming some of the material and trying to imagine it in your inner ear. I think a lot of composers, and maybe a lot of musicians too, talk about hearing things in their inner ear. I sometimes think that this is a really strange concept because I think scientifically we're not hearing anything. It's an imagination that is inside your head that you're trying to, it's like a memory. It's almost like trying to remember sound in space. Anything that can take you away from, if you like, the life support system of the computer playback is useful, because then you go back to the computer and then you're assessing that MIDI sound not just for itself, but as a template for what the reality will be. And those differences between the computer and live sound can be very small, but sometimes they can be quite large. And you also, when you hit the rehearsal room and it's really actually happening, you also need to be open-minded, not to shelve or throw away ideas that you'd thought about for a long time, but to be open to how they can come to life effectively. Sometimes I'll hear something and I'll think, oh, that's too fast or too slow. But I have to then ask myself, is that just because I'm used to hearing a computer playback? If I hadn't heard anything else up to this point in time, and I just heard it now, if I heard it with fresh ears, as we sometimes say, how would we assess it? So you've got to be prepared to be really open-minded, but also discerning.
Do you ever hear things in the recording that are suddenly like, oh my God, that's actually different than I imagined it, but I like it better? Does that happen?
I reckon that there are always surprises. Perhaps being experienced is in part doing things enough times so that you guess more accurately, more closer to what really is going to actually happen. But there are always surprises, and sometimes they're good surprises and sometimes they're less good surprises. Probably more often, I think, for the composer, it's the less good surprise. I hadn't anticipated that I couldn't hear this instrument, or I hadn't anticipated that this would really pop out. And you have to think, okay, what am I going to do about that? Am I going to change the octave of the instrument? And we did in some cases. For instance, there were a few parts where the piccolo was getting up really quite high into almost ref's whistle kind of territory. And there were a few points where we said, look, on balance, let's put that down the octave. Some places where we might have said this instrument maybe don't play that doubling for those two bars, changing dynamics. All of those things, I think what we're trying to do is saying from the discussions we had and all our thoughts about the piece, we're trying to adjust it to bring it to life, to make it sing.
Yeah. And I guess this is one of the best things about having the composer in the room with you when you're trying to, perform a work or rehearse a work to, in this case, record it. And it's important to point out that composers have done this throughout history. They've, kind of had, often composers have had orchestras play through their works just so that they can hear it. Brahms comes to mind in Austria, had a little orchestra that he was able to hear his symphonies and then make notes and make changes to the score, and then come back in another, few weeks and hear the changes. And I think that's really interesting, actually, to...
Yeah, I'm totally a fan of revision. I think that a first draft of a score should get as close as is possible. I think you have to pull out all stops to try and make it perfect first up. And then you go in with a mindset that anything that you can improve, you should. And so in that way, in fact, I think it was one of the poets, British poets, who said poems are never finished, only abandoned.
Yeah.
And so in part, you cut your cloth according to what's available, and any time when you get good rehearsal time or workshop time available, you're always just trying to get that little extra bit of polish, a little bit of extra life into the performance. Ben, maybe I should ask you, what is the difference in having to prepare a new score which no one has ever heard before? When my score lands on your desk and nobody's played it and you've just got the dots, how is that different from preparing a work, say, by Stravinsky, which you might have heard of dozens of other interpretations and maybe even have either recordings on your shelf or fantastic performances that you've been to that have been memorable? How is it different when it's tabula rasa, when there's nothing, just the score?
Well, it's the difference between, I suppose, building an interpretation of a work and actually just building a performance of the work, of the notes that you've got in front of you. In this instance, having your score there, it was handy for me to have the digital version as well, to be able to kind of hear how, kind of fit it together. But the biggest job for a conductor when they're performing a work for the first time of trying to get the musicians to play exactly what's on the page, because all of the instructions are there. There are certain things that the composer will hear and will change on the day, as we've discussed. But as the conductor's job is kind of to be the composer's representative on the podium in front of the musicians. And so I always defer to the composer. I say, oh, have we got the right tempo? Are there any other things that we need to change? And it's a really, proper collaboration in that sense. In terms of preparation, it's much the same. The way I prepare a score is by doing full harmonic analysis, thematic analysis, phrase structure, working out what kind of idiom we're working in terms of the style, how the sounds should come from the different instruments, what kind of colours that we're going to use from the instruments. I suppose I try and form the vision as close as I can to what your imagined vision of this work is. If I'm conducting a work that has been performed many times, there's certainly a tradition with many of those works that the orchestra will be familiar with them, and it's different. You're talking more about an interpretation, so you've got perhaps a little bit more freedom and almost a little bit more responsibility to make it somehow unique and cast some fresh eyes on this. So I think it's really a big difference between premiering something. It's a philosophical question of perhaps you should be like that all the time, actually, and just doing what the composer has said, or written on the piece. But you haven't always got the composer to ask. And in this case, it would be mad just to stick to the dots. It's much better to be able to ask you what it is that you want, what do you want changed. But it's not always the case. Most composers are dead, unfortunately.
And I guess a lot of those repertoire pieces also have been through a process of some revision and fine polishing. There were some things that we knew were going to be interesting issues that we'd have to see how it went on the day, like, for instance, the flugelhorn solos at the start and the end of the main double planet movement. There are pauses in there, but what we wanted was for the flugelhorn to be free and rhapsodic, but what's going on underneath in the orchestra is actually quite tightly controlled. Technically, bringing that off, we had a discussion about that before we even went into the rehearsal room about how we were going to go about that, and we needed then to adjust that and also to explain to the musicians what we had in mind and how we were going to do it, because the score actually doesn't say everything. It says quite a lot, but it doesn't say everything, and sometimes it's the conversation through you with the musicians that gives them an understanding of what's to be achieved, and therefore they say, yes, okay, we know what's going to go on, and we'll do that.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it, to think about the musicians aren't just automatons in this equation, are they? I mean, they've got a lot of input, obviously, into the interpretation, if we call it the interpretation of this work, our interpretation of your work. The musicians will come up with things, they're playing it for the first time, there's no preconceived way that they think they should play it, so it's pretty much an open book. They can be very expressive, and certainly with solo lines, I suppose it's that balance between knowing when you can take certain freedoms and liberties as a musician in the orchestra, depending on the function of your particular, line. Have you got a melodic line? Have you got an accompanying line? How does it all fit together? Do you have to be listening to other people, or can you be flexible? And I think it all comes down to this idea of interpretation being a very, very collaborative idea. It's not just, the conductor has decided it will go this way. I think, in my opinion, the best composers and the best conductors are open-minded and give the musicians quite a lot of freedom to express themselves. And so I suppose the next performance of this work, if it was with a different orchestra, even if I was the conductor, would be different than the one that we've had now.
Yeah, it can always be different. I guess you've got a certain sort of vision for the piece that you're hoping is going to come through, but there's not only one way that can happen, and so you don't need necessarily a single so-called authentic interpretation. What you need is one of possibly a number of interpretations that's going to fly, that's going to make the piece come to life in the spirit that it's intended. It was a fantastic process for me. You have to concentrate like crazy when all that's going on, because you spend literally hundreds of hours across maybe 6, 8, 12 months writing a piece like a a symphony. And then all of these interpretive decisions happen in an hour or two. It's this amazing compressed thing. It's like you have to make some decisions actually very quickly. You can't have a whole orchestra sitting there while you deliberate for 10 minutes on, should that be MP or MF? What will it be? You have to sort of trust your intuition and trust the conductor and the orchestra and give feedback as in as timely a manner as you can to keep the process going. So people's time is not wasted, but also people being brought into the process.
Yeah. Well, I suppose that is the difference between an experienced composer and somebody who perhaps is just starting out. The experienced composer will have preemptively identified where those problems and issues might be and is able to eliminate as many of them as possible before you get into the room, which is why we were able to do, you know, such quick work on your piece. And the issues that presented themselves that needed to be changed were actually very minimal. But I can imagine for some composers it'd be a bit of a freaky experience. And I've actually been in situations with younger composers who have come in and just gone, oh my God, I didn't, you know, prepare the parts well enough, or there's so many mistakes, you know, that I should have corrected, and they only realise by trying. So,
and it's, you know, even if you've done it many times, there's always something. There was one note I remember from the recording session which I wasn't sure about, but there were bigger issues, and it wasn't until weeks later that I worked out that there was a single sharp missing in the score. Which is not bad going, but nonetheless, that's the sort of thing that keeps you up at night.
It does. So you've been talking to me, Benjamin Northey, and composer Stuart Greenbaum. This resource has been developed by the MSO and Ping. Stuart, we would like to thank you so much for coming in. Please feel free to explore this website further and learn more about Symphony No. 2, Double Planet.